In the vast expanse of the Galactic Confederation, where 1,000 civilized species had learned to coexist in peaceful harmony, there existed an unspoken rule: never underestimate the quiet ones. For 3 centuries, the galaxy had known of Earth and its peculiar inhabitants, humans, who had somehow survived on what most considered the most hostile planet ever to evolve sentient life. But they had never met Jake Morrison. When the first human stepped on his station Kepler 442, the galaxy's most prestigious educational hub, the other species thought they knew what to expect. After all, humans have been trading partners for decades, their diplomats were reasonable, and their scientists brilliant, if slightly unorthodox. They were just another species trying to find their place among the stars. They were catastrophically wrong. What they didn't know was that Jake Morrison wasn't just any human. He was an Australian. And on a planet where everything was already trying to kill you, Australians had learned to laugh at death itself. As Jake would later explain to his terrified alien classmates while casually handling what they considered a Class 7 biohazard with his bare hands, "Back home, we call this Tuesday." The galaxy was about to learn that there were humans, and then there were Australians. And Jake Morrison was about to teach them the difference in ways that would reshape their understanding of what it meant to be truly, utterly, magnificently insane enough to not just survive, but thrive in a universe that constantly tried to kill everything in it. This is the story of how one exchange student from the most dangerous continent on the most dangerous planet in known space accidentally became a legend, started 3 diplomatic incidents, revolutionized 4 academic fields, and somehow made the entire galaxy question everything they thought they knew about courage, determination, and the art of not giving up. Ever. Jake Morrison stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately noticed 3 things. First, the air tasted wrong, too clean, like someone had forgotten to add the proper amount of dust, and danger that made breathing worthwhile. Second, every single alien in the docking bay had stopped what they were doing to stare at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to what he could only describe as mild terror. Third, and most importantly, his backpack was making a concerning rattling sound that suggested his emergency supply of Vegemite had not survived the journey intact. "Bloody hell," he muttered, adjusting the pack, and, completely missing the way half the crowd, took an involuntary step backward at his casual profanity. On most worlds, casual blasphemy was considered either deeply offensive or a sign of imminent violence. Jake, however, was Australian and therefore constitutionally incapable of completing a sentence without at least one mild oath. The Kepler 442 educational station stretched out before him like a crystal cathedral, all flowing curves and impossible geometries that made his engineering brain itch with curiosity. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy moved through the halls in orderly, civilized patterns, their conversations a constant hum of translated languages. It was, by any reasonable standard, magnificent. Jake immediately decided he was going to like this place. His first stop was supposed to be the Orientation Center, where a carefully selected team of xenopsychologists would ease him into life among alien species. Instead, he took a wrong turn, the first of many that would define his time here, and found himself in what the signs helpfully identified as the Hazardous Materials Research Wing. Authorized personnel only. Perfect, Jake said, because if there was one thing Australians were good at, it was ignoring warning signs. He'd been ignoring them his entire life, starting with the ones his mother had put up around the backyard shed where she kept the anti-venom, and continuing through his university years where he'd majored in applied physics with a minor in what could possibly go wrong. The first person he met was Dr. Zixth, a mantis-like Vraxian whose species had evolved on a world where the most dangerous predator was a particularly aggressive flower. Dr. Zixth was conducting an experiment involving what appeared to be a small, contained singularity when Jake wandered into his lab. "Excuse me, mate," Jake said, causing Dr. Zixth to emit a high-pitched sound of surprise that temporarily disrupted the containment field. "I think I'm lost. Could you point me toward the Orientation Center?" Dr. Zixth stared at Jake with compound eyes that reflected his image 1,000 times. The human appeared completely calm despite having just witnessed a near-catastrophic breach of space-time. More disturbing, he seemed genuinely interested in the experiment rather than terrified by it. "You are human?" Dr. Zixth managed, his translator struggling with the concept. "Australian, specifically," Jake corrected, as if this explained everything. In a way it did. "Jake Morrison, exchange student. Mind if I ask what you're doing with that black hole? Looks brilliant." Dr. Zixth's head tilted in confusion. The translation must be wrong. No sane being would describe a contained gravitational anomaly capable of consuming the entire station as brilliant. Yet the human's vital signs, as read by the lab sensors, showed nothing but calm interest and what the computer helpfully labeled as mild amusement. "This is a Class 5 gravitational research station," Dr. Zixth explained carefully. "One mistake could collapse local space-time and destroy everything within a light-minute radius." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, we've got something similar back home. My mate Dave tried to make a beer can crusher using a modified gravity well. Nearly took out Perth." Dr. Zixth decided that either his translator was malfunctioning or humans were far more dangerous than anyone had suspected. Possibly both. "Perhaps," Dr. Zixth said delicately, "you should attend your orientation first?" Jake shrugged. "Fair enough. But if you ever want to make that thing more efficient, you might want to try inverting the polarity on the tertiary containment field. We learned that one the hard way when Dave's mate Steve tried to improve on the design." With that casual suggestion, which would later revolutionize gravitational physics and earn Dr. Zixth the Galactic Science Prize, Jake wandered back out into the corridor. His next encounter was with a group of Aquarian students whose species had evolved in the peaceful depths of a tidally locked ocean world. They were clustered around what appeared to be a small, harmless creature in a containment unit, discussing their xenobiology assignment with the kind of careful academic precision that suggested they'd never encountered anything more dangerous than a strongly worded peer review. "Oh, cool," Jake said, approaching the group. "What V you got there?" The lead student, whose name translated roughly to gentle current through peaceful kelp, looked up with relief. Perhaps this human could help them understand their assignment. "We are studying this specimen for our xenobiology course," she explained. "It is from the Rigel system and appears to be some form of parasitic organism. However, we cannot determine its exact function or danger level." Jake peered into the containment unit and grinned. Inside was what looked like a cross between a spider, a scorpion, and someone's worst nightmare, complete with barbed legs, acid-dripping mandibles, and eyes that seemed to follow movement with predatory intelligence. "Oh, that's easy," Jake said cheerfully. "That's a Rigelian facehugger. Parasitic reproduction cycle. Implants eggs through the nasal cavity, gestation period of about 3 days before the offspring bursts out through the chest cavity. Nasty little buggers, but not too bright. You can usually just grab them behind the head, and they can't do much." The Aquarian students stared at him in horror as he casually reached toward the containment unit. "Wait," gentle current through peaceful kelp squeaked. "The containment protocols clearly state that direct contact could result in immediate parasitic infection and death." Jake paused, hand halfway to the unit. "Oh, right. Yeah, probably should mention I've been inoculated against most of the common parasites. Occupational hazard of growing up in Australia. We've got worse things than this in our garden sheds." He said this with the same casual tone one might use to discuss the weather, completely oblivious to the fact that he just claimed to have survived encounters with creatures that had wiped out entire research teams. "You have survived encounters with these creatures?" another student asked weakly. "Well, not these specifically," Jake admitted. "But we've got drop bears, Sydney funnel web spiders, box jellyfish, blue-ringed octopi, and about a dozen species of snake that can kill you in under 5 minutes. Mom always said the real trick is not to show fear. They can smell it." The Aquarian students exchanged glances. Their homeworld's most dangerous predator was a particularly aggressive type of sea cucumber. "Perhaps," Gentle current through peaceful kelp said faintly. You could help us with our assignment? Jake brightened. Sure. Just remember, with parasites like this, confidence is key. They've evolved to target the weak and frightened. Act like you belong at the top of the food chain, and they'll usually leave you alone. As Jake began explaining the finer points of apex predator psychology to a group of beings whose species had never evolved beyond filter feeding, word of the strange human began to spread through the station's communication networks. By the time Jake finally found the orientation center, his reputation had preceded him. Dr. Zeroff, the station's chief xenopsychologist, had been hastily reviewing every piece of data the Confederation had on human psychology, and what he was finding was deeply concerning. According to the files, humans had evolved on a Class 12 death world where the atmospheric composition was technically toxic to most species. The gravity was nearly triple standard, and the native life forms included creatures that could kill through methods ranging from venom to aggressive parasitism to simply being in the same general area. Most disturbingly, humans seem to have not only survived this environment, but actually thrived in it, developing what the reports described as an unusual psychological adaptation characterized by the tendency to seek out dangerous situations for recreational purposes. Jake Morrison, according to his academic records, was a perfect example of this adaptation. His undergraduate thesis had been titled Practical Applications of Controlled Chaos Theory in High-Energy Physics, and his recreational activities included something called crocodile wrestling, which the computer assured Dr. Zeroff was exactly what it sounded like. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Zeroff said carefully as Jake finally arrived at orientation, nearly 4 hours late, and somehow carrying what appeared to be a small gravitational anomaly detector he'd borrowed from Dr. Zixtiach's lab. Welcome to Kepler 442. I trust you're finding everything satisfactory. Jake grinned, an expression that on most species indicated either aggression or digestive distress, but on humans apparently meant something called happiness. Brilliant place you got here, Doc. Already learned more in one afternoon than I did in my last semester back home. Though you might want to upgrade your hazmat protocols, ran into a few things that could probably use better containment. Dr. Zeroff felt something that his species called impending dune paralysis, but which humans would recognize as anxiety. You've been exploring? Just having a look around, Jake said innocently. Met some lovely folks, helped with a few experiments, picked up this neat little doohickey. He held up the gravitational detector, which was currently emitting a soft humming sound and displaying readings that suggested the local spacetime was experiencing minor fluctuations. Dr. Zixtiach said I could borrow it to map the station's gravity wells. Apparently, there's some interesting stuff happening near the central hub. Dr. Zeroff made a note to have a serious conversation with Dr. Zixtiach about lending dangerous equipment to unsupervised humans, particularly Australian humans, who according to the files were a subset of an already dangerous species characterized by what the reports described as aggressive optimism and a pathological inability to recognize mortal danger. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Zeroff said carefully, I believe we should discuss some basic safety protocols. For the next 2 hours, Dr. Zeroff attempted to explain the carefully constructed rules and regulations that kept thousands of different species safely coexisting in the same space. He covered everything from basic xenobiology to diplomatic etiquette, from emergency procedures to the proper handling of hazardous materials. Jake listened politely, nodding at appropriate intervals and asking questions that suggested he was actually paying attention. This gave Dr. Zeroff a false sense of security that was shattered when Jake's final question turned out to be, so what you're saying is, most of this stuff would probably kill me, but as long as I'm careful and use common sense, I should be fine? That is a significant oversimplification, but essentially correct, Dr. Zeroff admitted. Jake grinned again. No worries then. I've been not dying my whole life. Pretty good at it by now. As Jake left the orientation center with a data pad full of safety protocols he would inevitably ignore and a schedule of classes that would never contain him, Dr. Zeroff made 2 decisions. First, He would be monitoring this human very carefully. Second, he would be updating his personal insurance policy. Somewhere in the depths of the station, in a laboratory that specialized in theoretical xenobiology, a computer algorithm detected an unusual pattern in the day's sensor readings. The pattern suggested that a single individual had somehow caused 17 separate safety protocol violations, improved the efficiency of a Class 5 gravitational research station, correctly identified a Rigelian parasitic organism, and managed to acquire restricted scientific equipment without authorization. The computer, which had been programmed by beings who believed in order and predictability, spent several minutes attempting to process this information before finally categorizing it under anomalous events requiring further investigation. It was the beginning of what would later be known as the Morrison effect. In his newly assigned quarters, which he'd immediately begun modifying in ways that would horrify the safety inspectors, Jake Morrison unpacked his belongings and began planning his first proper day as an exchange student. He had classes in advanced quantum mechanics, interspecies relations, and something called practical applications of xenobiology that sounded interesting. He also had a growing list of things he wanted to explore, including the hydroponics bay, which supposedly contained plants from a dozen different worlds, the engineering section, which he suspected he could improve, and the central hub's gravity, well, which according to his baro detector was doing something weird. As he settled in for the night, Jake Morrison had no idea that his arrival had already begun to reshape the careful, ordered world of Kepler 442 Educational Station. He was just a student from Australia, after all. How much trouble could one human possibly cause? The galaxy was about to find out. Jake Morrison's first formal class was Advanced Quantum Mechanics, taught by Professor Quindar, a crystalline being whose species had achieved spaceflight by literally thinking their way out of their planet's gravity well. The silicoids were known throughout the galaxy for their precise, mathematical approach to problem-solving and their complete inability to understand why other species insisted on doing things the hard way. Professor Quindar had been teaching quantum mechanics for 300 years and had never encountered a student who approached the subject with anything other than appropriate reverence and careful academic precision. This was about to change. Jake arrived 5 minutes late, apologized cheerfully to the professor, and immediately raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Morrison," Professor Quindar said, his crystalline structure shifting to a slightly concerned amber hue. "Just wondering, mate, when you talk about quantum uncertainty, are you including gravitational effects in your calculations? Because back home, we've found that if you're dealing with anything heavier than a small moon, you need to account for localized space-time distortion or your uncertainty principles start getting a bit wobbly." The classroom, which contained representatives from 12 different species, fell completely silent. Professor Quindar's color shifted to a deep blue that indicated either deep thought or complete confusion. "Mr. Morrison," Professor Quindar said carefully, "the gravitational effects you describe would only be relevant in extreme circumstances involving massive objects or high-energy physics applications." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "Right, that's what we thought too, until my mate Dave tried to build a quantum computer in his garage and accidentally created a temporal loop that lasted 3 weeks. Turned out the mass of the Earth was actually significant enough to affect quantum decoherence rates if you weren't careful about your calculations." A Vraxian student in the front row made a choking sound. A temporal loop lasting 3 weeks would have been a galaxy-threatening disaster requiring immediate intervention from the Confederation's emergency response teams. The human was discussing it like a minor inconvenience. "Your friend, Professor Quindar," said slowly, "created a temporal anomaly. In a garage." "Well, technically it was a shed," Jake corrected. "But, yeah, took us ages to sort out. Had to call in Steve's cousin who worked for the university physics department. She brought some proper equipment and managed to collapse the loop without too much trouble. Though Dave did age backward by about 6 months, which he said was actually pretty neat." Professor Quindar spent several moments cycling through colors that had no translation in any known language before settling on a pale gray, that usually indicated system shut down for safety purposes. Perhaps, he said weakly, you could share the mathematical framework your friend used? Sure, Jake said, pulling out his datapad. Though I should warn you, it gets a bit hairy around the third-order differential equations. Steve's cousin had to invent a whole new type of calculus just to describe what Dave had accidentally done. For the next hour, Jake proceeded to revolutionize quantum mechanics by casually describing experiments that should have been impossible, mathematical frameworks that shouldn't have worked, and safety protocols that consisted entirely of Dave's cousin said to make sure you're wearing safety goggles and have someone standing by with a fire extinguisher. By the end of class, Professor Quindar had filled 17 data storage units with notes. 3 graduate students had submitted requests to transfer to Earth's educational exchange program, and the station's main computer had logged its first-ever academic paradigm shift alert. Jake's second class was interspecies relations, which was supposed to teach students the delicate art of communicating across cultural barriers without accidentally starting wars. The course was taught by Ambassador Trilvex, whose species had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of diplomatic non-confrontation. Ambassador Trilvex began the class with a standard scenario: first contact between 2 previously unknown species with different cultural values and communication styles. The goal was to establish peaceful dialogue without causing offense. Mr. Morrison, Ambassador Trilvex said, perhaps you could demonstrate the proper approach to this scenario? Jake read the situation brief, which described a species that communicated primarily through complex ritualized displays of submission and considered direct eye contact to be a mortal insult. Easy, Jake said. You walk up, look them straight in the eye, and say, "Day, mate, how's it going?" The classroom erupted in horrified gasps. Ambassador Trilvex's color shifted to what could only be described as diplomatic crisis orange. Mr. Morrison, Ambassador Trilvex said carefully, that approach would likely result in immediate warfare. Jake shrugged, maybe for the first 5 minutes. But, see, here's the thing about establishing dominance. Most species respect confidence. You show them you're not afraid, that you're willing to engage directly, and they'll usually respond in kind. Sure, they might try to kill you a bit at first, but once they realize you're not backing down, they'll start to respect you. This is not how diplomacy works, Ambassador Trilvex insisted. Maybe not fancy diplomacy, Jake admitted, but it's how Australians work. Back home, our approach to dangerous situations is usually to walk right up to them and see what happens. Works pretty well most of the time. A Centaurian student raised a delicate hand. But what if they actually do try to kill you? Jake grinned. Well, that's when things get interesting. See, the thing about Australians is we're really hard to kill. Comes from living on a planet that's been trying to murder us for about 60,000 years. We've gotten pretty good at not dying. Ambassador Trilvex made a note to review humanity's diplomatic credentials. Either the Confederation's files on human diplomatic methodology were seriously incomplete, or Jake Morrison represented a particularly unusual subset of human negotiators. Perhaps, Ambassador Trilvex suggested, we could explore some alternative approaches. For the rest of the class, Jake proceeded to describe successful diplomatic encounters that sounded more like action-adventure stories than peace negotiations. There was the time his uncle had established trade relations with a previously hostile alien mining operation by challenging their leader to a drinking contest. The incident where his sister had resolved a territorial dispute by teaching both sides how to play cricket. The famous Great Barrier Reef incident, where a team of Australian marine biologists had prevented an interstellar war by introducing a group of militant aquatic aliens to surfing. By the end of class, Ambassador Trilvex had begun to suspect that either human diplomatic training was vastly different from what he'd been led to believe, or Australia was operating under a completely different set of international relations principles than the rest of Earth. Jake's third class was practical applications of xenobiology, which he'd been looking forward to since his arrival. The course was taught by Dr. Kethril, whose species had evolved as environmental scientists on a carefully controlled garden world where the most dangerous creature was a mildly venomous flower. Dr. Kethrell had designed the course to give students safe, controlled exposure to alien life forms under carefully monitored conditions. The first lab exercise involved observing a small, harmless herbivore from the vegan system and documenting its behavioral patterns. Jake took one look at the creature, which resembled a cross between a rabbit and a small dinosaur, and immediately opened the containment unit. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Kethrell shrieked. "The safety protocols clearly state." "It's fine," Jake said, gently picking up the creature, which immediately began purring and nuzzling against his hand. "Look, it's just scared. Probably been in that box for hours. Poor little fella just needs some proper handling." The other students watched in fascination as the creature, which had been hiding in the corner of its containment unit for weeks, immediately relaxed in Jake's hands and began displaying behaviors they'd never seen before. "Remarkable," breathed a Regellian student. "It appears to be exhibiting trust behaviors with an unknown species." "Not that unknown," Jake said, scratching the creature behind what appeared to be ears. "See, most herbivores respond to the same basic signals: calm voice, slow movements, confident handling. This little guy's probably just been stressed because everyone's been treating him like he's dangerous." Dr. Kethrell watched in amazement as Jake proceeded to demonstrate animal handling techniques that should have taken weeks of specialized training to master. The creature was not only calm, but actively seeking affection, displaying social behaviors that weren't even documented in the literature. "How did you know to do that?" Dr. Kethrell asked. "Back home, I help out at the local wildlife sanctuary," Jake explained. "We get everything from injured koalas to confused cassowaries. Once you understand the basic principles of animal psychology, most creatures aren't that different. They want food, safety, and social interaction. This little fella's probably been lonely." For the next hour, Jake transformed what was supposed to be a simple observation exercise into an impromptu masterclass on interspecies animal psychology. He demonstrated techniques for reading body language across species barriers, explained the universal principles of trust building with nervous animals, and somehow managed to get the creature to perform complex social behaviors that Dr. Kethrell had never seen before. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Kethrell said as the class ended, "would you be interested in assisting with some of our more challenging specimens?" Jake brightened. "You've got dangerous ones?" "Brilliant." Dr. Kethrell immediately began to regret the offer. Word of Jake's unusual teaching methods had begun to spread throughout the station's academic community. By the time he arrived at the dining hall for lunch, he found himself surrounded by students and faculty members who had heard various versions of the morning's events. "Is it true you created a temporal anomaly in a shed?" asked a Centaurian physicist. "Did you really establish diplomatic relations through cricket?" wondered an Arcturian political science student. "Can you actually communicate with non-sapient species?" inquired a vegan xenobiologist. Jake found himself at the center of what could only be described as an impromptu academic conference, with beings from across the galaxy hanging on his every word as he described the practical realities of life on Earth. "The thing you have to understand," Jake explained between bites of what the station's food synthesizers assured him was a close approximation of a meat pie, "is that Earth isn't like most worlds. We've got about 12 different ecosystem types, gravity that'll crush most species, atmospheric composition that's technically toxic, and native life forms that range from merely dangerous to will kill you for looking at them wrong. So we've had to get creative about problem solving." A silicoid engineer leaned forward with interest. "Creative how?" "Well, take the Sydney Harbor Bridge project," Jake said. "Massive engineering challenge. Build a bridge across a harbor that's full of creatures that could kill you, in an environment that's actively trying to corrode your materials, while dealing with weather patterns that include everything from cyclones to bushfires." "How did your people approach this challenge?" asked the engineer. "They built it anyway," Jake said simply. "Took 8 years, cost 14 lives, and the whole time they just kept working around the problems. Shark attack. Build a shark cage around the work platform. Cyclone season. Work at night. Metal corrosion. Invent a new type of steel. Problem solving through pure, stubborn determination." The assembled academics exchanged glances. This approach to engineering challenges was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. But surely, said a Vraxian safety specialist, your people must have some form of risk assessment protocols? Jay considered this. Well, yeah. We call it the she'll be right mate principle, which involves, basically, you assume everything will probably work out fine, and if it doesn't, you deal with it when it happens. Hasn't failed us yet. The safety specialist made a note to review all existing protocols for human-involved projects. After lunch, Jake had been scheduled for individual study time, which he interpreted as free time to explore the station without supervision. This was a mistake on the part of the academic planners, who had assumed that a student would spend this time in the library or reviewing course materials. Instead, Jake headed straight for the hydroponics bay, where the station grew fresh food using carefully controlled ecosystems from dozens of different worlds. It was, according to the promotional materials, a masterpiece of agricultural engineering that safely contained potentially dangerous plant species from across the galaxy. The hydroponics bay was managed by Dr. Yilf, a plant-based Floranian whose species had evolved from something resembling an intelligent tree. Dr. Yilf had spent 50 years carefully cultivating the most comprehensive collection of xenobotanical specimens in the galaxy, with safety protocols that ensured no plant could spread beyond its designated growing area. Jake took one look at the setup and immediately identified 17 ways to improve efficiency. Dr. Yilf, Jake said, approaching the Floranian who was carefully tending a collection of Rigelian nutrient pods. I'm Jake Morrison, exchange student. Mind if I ask you about your pollination systems? Dr. Yilf, whose species communicated primarily through chemical signals that the universal translators converted to speech, rustled his leaves in a pattern that indicated mild curiosity. Our pollination is carefully controlled to prevent cross-contamination between species, Dr. Yilf explained. Each plant is maintained in isolation to ensure genetic purity. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Right, but you're missing some serious opportunities for beneficial hybridization. See, back home, we've found that controlled crossbreeding between compatible plant species can actually improve resistance to diseases and pests. Cross-contamination between alien species could result in catastrophic ecological disaster, Dr. Yilf pointed out. Could do, Jake agreed. But it could also result in superplants that are hardier, more nutritious, and better adapted to station life. You just got to be smart about which ones you cross. For the next hour, Jake proceeded to demonstrate agricultural techniques that sounded simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. He explained companion planting strategies that could increase yields by 400%, described natural pest control methods that involved introducing helpful predators to the growing environment, and outlined breeding programs that could create entirely new species adapted specifically to station conditions. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Yilf said carefully, these techniques, have they been tested? Oh yeah, Jake said cheerfully. My grand's been using them on her farm for decades. She's got tomatoes the size of watermelons and wheat that can survive cyclones. Of course, she's also got some interesting mutations that probably shouldn't exist, but that's half the fun. Dr. Yilf made a note to research Earth's agricultural safety standards. Based on this conversation, they appear to be either non-existent or very different from galactic norms. By the end of the day, Jake had somehow managed to propose revolutionary changes to 3 separate academic fields, accidentally solve 2 long-standing research problems, and convince half the station's faculty that humans were either geniuses or completely insane. Possibly both. As evening approached, and Jake headed back to his quarters, he passed through the station's central hub, where his borrowed gravitational detector began emitting an increasingly urgent series of beeps. According to the readings, the station's gravity well was fluctuating in ways that suggested either equipment malfunction or something far more interesting. Jake paused, studying the readings with growing excitement. The patterns looked familiar, very similar to what Dave's cousin had recorded just before the Great Temporal Loop incident. Huh, Jake said to himself. Wonder what they're doing down there. As he made his way to his quarters, Jake began planning his next day's activities. He had more classes, of course, but he also had a growing list of experiments he wanted to try, systems he wanted to improve, and mysteries he wanted to investigate. Behind him, in the academic departments he'd visited, faculty members were hastily revising curricula, updating safety protocols, and trying to figure out how to contain a student who had apparently learned more about their respective fields in one day than most species learned in a lifetime. The Morrison effect was beginning to spread, and Kepler 442 Educational Station would never be quite the same again. Jake Morrison's third day on Kepler 442 began with what the station's AI systems later classified as anomalous gravitational readings originating from Residential Sector 7, Room 142, which happened to be Jake's quarters. The source of the anomaly was Jake's morning exercise routine, which consisted of push-ups, sit-ups, and what he cheerfully described as a bit of a run around the corridors. What the sensors detected was a human moving at speeds that should have been impossible in the station's artificial gravity, generating kinetic forces that briefly disrupted the local space-time curvature. Dr. Zaroff, who had been monitoring Jake's activities with growing concern, received the alert just as he was reviewing a disturbing report from the previous day's faculty meetings. According to the compiled data, Jake Morrison had somehow managed to propose solutions to problems that had stymied galactic academia for centuries, demonstrate techniques that shouldn't have worked according to known physics, and do it all with the casual confidence of someone discussing the weather. Computer, Dr. Zaroff said carefully, display Mr. Morrison's current location and activities. The holographic display showed Jake in the station's main corridor, jogging at a pace that the sensors insisted was approximately 30 kilometers per hour, while carrying what appeared to be improvised weights made from compressed metallic components of unknown origin. Computer, identify the objects Mr. Morrison is carrying. Analysis inconclusive. Objects appear to be constructed from various station components, including what may be redundant gravitational stabilizer units, emergency power cells, and is that a food synthesizer? Dr. Zaroff felt the familiar sensation of impending headache. Has Mr. Morrison been disassembling station equipment? Negative. Items appear to have been acquired through legitimate means. Mr. Morrison submitted 17 equipment requisition forms yesterday evening, all of which were automatically approved as they fell within parameters for academic research materials. Academic research? Mr. Morrison listed his project as practical applications of variable gravity exercise physiology and comparative analysis of artificial versus natural gravitational fields. Both projects have been approved by the station's automated academic review system. Dr. Zaroff made a note to review the station's automatic approval protocols. Clearly, they had not been designed with humans in mind. Meanwhile, Jake was enjoying his morning run and completely unaware of the chaos he was causing in the station's monitoring systems. The artificial gravity felt weird compared to Earth's natural pull, and he discovered that by adjusting his stride pattern, he could actually use the station's rotating sections to his advantage, building up momentum in ways that felt almost like surfing. It was during this run that Jake first noticed the anomaly. His borrowed gravitational detector, which he'd been carrying to map the station's gravity wells, suddenly began emitting a pattern of beeps that he recognized from his undergraduate physics courses. According to the readings, something in the station's central core was generating gravitational waves that followed a distinctly unnatural pattern. Jake slowed to a stop, studying the detector's display with growing excitement. The wave pattern looked almost artificial, too regular to be natural, but too complex to be a simple mechanical malfunction. Bloody hell, Jake muttered, which caused 3 passing Centaurian students to duck behind a nearby wall. That's not supposed to happen. The gravitational waves were coming from somewhere deep in the station's restricted sections, far below the public areas where students and faculty normally traveled. According to the station maps Jake had memorized, that area was labeled simply as deep core engineering, with a notation that it was off-limits to all but essential personnel. Jake grinned. He'd always been terrible at following rules. Finding his way to the restricted sections turned out to be easier than expected. Jake simply followed the gravitational readings, which led him through a series of maintenance corridors that became increasingly unpolished and industrial as he descended deeper into the station. The first security checkpoint was automated, designed to scan for authorized personnel and deny entry to anyone without proper clearance. It was not, however, designed to handle someone who approached security barriers with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. Jake said cheerfully to the security scanner. Jake Morrison, here for the gravitational anomaly investigation. The scanner's AI, which had been programmed by beings who believed in orderly hierarchies and proper authorization, struggled to process this response. The human was clearly not authorized personnel, but he was discussing classified information that only authorized personnel should know about. The logical contradiction caused the system to default to its emergency protocols. Please state your authorization code, the scanner requested. Jake looked thoughtful. Well, I don't have a code, but Dr. ZXTH sent me down a check on the gravitational fluctuations. Said they were getting some weird readings upstairs and wanted someone to take a look. This was technically true, though Jake was omitting the fact that Dr. ZXTH had no idea Jake was planning this investigation. The scanner's AI, however, confirmed that Dr. ZXTH was indeed authorized for gravitational research and that there had been recent reports of anomalous readings. Authorized entry granted. Please observe all safety protocols. Jake nodded solemnly. No guedes, mate. Always follow the safety protocols. The doors slid open, and Jake found himself in what appeared to be the station's deep engineering section, where massive gravitational generators created the artificial gravity that kept everyone safely on the floor. It was an impressive sight, enormous machines that bent space-time itself, all humming along in perfect harmony. Except for one. The source of the gravitational anomaly was immediately obvious. One of the massive generators was operating at a frequency that didn't match the others, creating a standing wave pattern that was slowly building in intensity. According to Jake's detector, the wave was growing stronger every few hours. That's not good, Jake said to himself, because even by Australian standards, an unstable gravitational generator was probably something to be concerned about. He was studying the machine's control panel, trying to understand what was causing the malfunction, when he was interrupted by a voice behind him. You are not authorized to be here. Jake turned to find himself facing a being that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a telephone pole, with additional arms that ended in what appeared to be precision engineering tools. According to the translation badge on its chest, this was Chief Engineer Vorthake. Jake Morrison, Jake said, extending his hand in the universal human gesture of greeting. Dr. ZXTH sent me down a check on your gravitational readings. Looks like you've got a bit of a problem with Generator 7. Chief Engineer Vorthake did not shake Jake's hand, partly because his species didn't have that cultural practice, and partly because he was trying to process how a student had managed to reach a restricted area and immediately identify a problem that his engineering team had been working on for weeks. Student Morrison, Vorthake said carefully, this area is restricted because the equipment is extremely dangerous. A mistake could destabilize the entire station. Jake nodded understandingly. Yeah, gravitational engineering's tricky stuff. Mind if I take a look at your frequency harmonics? I think I might know what's causing the problem. Vorthake's compound eyes reflected Jake's image dozens of times as he struggled to process this request. On one hand, the human was clearly not authorized to be here and should be removed immediately. On the other hand, Vorthake's team had been struggling with this problem for weeks, and the human had identified the specific generator in less than 5 minutes. You have experience with gravitational engineering? Vorthake asked. Some, Jake said modestly. My mate Dave's cousin works in applied physics, and she's taught me a bit about frequency harmonics. Plus, I did my undergraduate thesis on controlled chaos theory, which turns out to be surprisingly relevant to gravitational stability. Vorthake decided that perhaps a consultation wouldn't hurt. If nothing else, He could have the human removed after determining how much damage had been done by the security breach. Very well, but you will observe all safety protocols and touch nothing without permission. Jake nodded agreeably. No worries. Safety first. For the next hour, Jake proceeded to demonstrate an understanding of gravitational engineering that should have required decades of specialized education. He identified the specific frequency mismatch that was causing the standing wave, explained how the problem was being amplified by harmonic resonance with the station's rotation, and proposed a solution that was both elegant and theoretically sound. You see, Jake explained, pointing to a series of readings on the control display, the problem isn't with generator 7 itself. It's with the phase relationship between 7 and generators 3 and 11. They're creating a resonance cascade that's slowly building energy in the local spacetime. Vorthike studied the readings with growing amazement. The human was right. More than that, the solution Jake was proposing would not only fix the immediate problem, but actually improve the overall efficiency of the entire gravitational array. This resonance pattern, Vorthike said slowly. How did you identify it so quickly? Jake shrugged. It's the same principle as tuning a guitar. You've got multiple strings that need to vibrate in harmony, and if one of them is slightly off, it creates interference patterns with the others. Same thing here, just with space-time instead of sound waves. Vorthake made a mental note to research human musical theory. If it was relevant to gravitational engineering, perhaps there were other applications they were missing. Mr. Morrison, Vorthake said carefully, would you be willing to assist with implementing this solution? Under strict supervision, of course. Jake brightened. Absolutely. This is brilliant stuff. Back home, the most complex gravitational work we do is making sure the toilets flush properly in Earth's gravity well. For the next 3 hours, Jake worked alongside Vorthake's engineering team to implement the frequency corrections that would stabilize the gravitational array. It should have been a delicate, dangerous operation requiring extreme precision and careful monitoring. Instead, it turned into something resembling a friendly collaboration between species, with Jake explaining Earth-based engineering principles that somehow applied to problems the galactic community had been struggling with for years. The thing about chaos theory, Jake explained as he made minute adjustments to the frequency modulation controls, is that it teaches you to look for the underlying patterns in apparently random systems. Most engineering problems aren't really chaotic, they just look that way until you find the right perspective. A junior engineer, whose species had evolved from aquatic filter feeders and therefore approached all problems with methodical precision, watched in fascination as Jake made adjustments that would have taken their team weeks to calculate. How do you know those settings will work? The engineer asked. Experience mostly, Jake admitted. Plus, you can feel when the resonance is right. It's like, you know how some music just sounds right? Same principle here. The space-time distortion has a rhythm to it, and when you get the frequencies aligned properly, everything starts to feel harmonious. Vorthake was beginning to suspect that human engineering education was vastly different from galactic standard practices. Either that, or Jake Morrison was some sort of intuitive genius who understood fundamental principles that most species had to learn through decades of careful study. Both possibilities were disturbing. The gravitational array repair was completed without incident, and the standing wave pattern that had been building for weeks simply evaporated as the generators fell into proper harmonic alignment. According to the monitoring systems, the array was now operating at 127% of design efficiency, an improvement that should have been impossible. Excellent work, Mr. Morrison, Vorthake said, his tone suggesting genuine respect. Perhaps you would be interested in joining our engineering team on a more permanent basis? Jake looked tempted for a moment, then shook his head. Thanks for the offer, but I'm here as a student. Though if you ever want to try some of the more experimental approaches, let me know. I've got a few ideas about gravitational field manipulation that might interest you. As Jake made his way back to the upper levels of the station, he was unaware that his impromptu engineering consultation had just solved a problem that had been classified as a potential station-threatening emergency. He was also unaware that word of his solution was spreading through the engineering community with the speed of gossip and the impact of a revolution. Chief Engineer Vorthik K, meanwhile, was composing a report that he knew no one would believe. A human exchange student had somehow infiltrated the station's most secure area, identified a critical engineering problem, and solved it using principles that weren't in any textbook. The report concluded with a recommendation that Jake Morrison be given unlimited access to the engineering sections and a formal position as a consulting specialist. It was the first of what would become known as the Morrison Protocols. By the time Jake reached his afternoon classes, news of the gravitational array incident had begun to circulate through the station's academic network. Jake himself remained blissfully unaware of the growing legend surrounding his activities, focused instead on his scheduled coursework and the increasingly interesting mysteries he kept discovering around every corner. His afternoon class was Advanced Theoretical Physics, taught by Dr. Quelthor, whose species had achieved spaceflight by developing mathematical models so precise they could predict the behavior of individual atoms across galactic distances. Dr. Quelthor began the class with a standard problem: calculating the gravitational effects of a binary star system on nearby planetary orbits. It was a complex problem that normally required weeks of careful mathematical analysis. Jake completed it in 17 minutes, including the time it took him to factor in solar wind variations and magnetic field interactions that weren't part of the original problem. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Quelthor said carefully, "Perhaps you could explain your methodology?" Jake looked up from his datapad, where he'd been doodling what appeared to be schematics for some sort of propulsion system. "Oh, the binary star thing? Yeah, it's just a three-body problem with gravitational wave interference. You can approximate the solution using modified orbital mechanics if you account for the resonance patterns between the two stellar masses." Dr. Quelthor stared at the solution. It was not only correct, but included several variables that weren't taught until graduate-level courses. "Where did you learn these techniques?" Dr. Quelthor asked. Jake shrugged. "Bit of this, bit of that. My mate Dave's cousin is always working on interesting problems, and she's taught me some useful shortcuts. Plus, we had to do similar calculations for the lunar mining project." "Lunar mining project?" "Oh yeah. Australia's got mining rights for about half the moon. Tricky engineering problem, though. You've got to account for Earth's gravity, the moon's rotation, and solar radiation pressure all at the same time. Plus the occasional asteroid impact, which really throws off your orbital calculations." Dr. Quelthor made a note to research Earth's lunar mining operations. Based on Jake's casual description, humanity was apparently conducting large-scale, space-based resource extraction using techniques that sounded far more advanced than their official technology assessments indicated. For the rest of the class, Jake continued to demonstrate mathematical abilities that suggested either a completely different approach to physics education or an intuitive understanding of universal principles that most species spent centuries developing. As the day ended and Jake headed back to his quarters, he reflected on what had turned out to be another interesting day of learning. He'd solved an engineering problem, attended some fascinating classes, and discovered that the station's gravitational systems were far more sophisticated than anything they had back home. He was also beginning to suspect that there might be other interesting mysteries hidden in the station's restricted areas. The gravitational array had been just the beginning. According to his detector, there were at least 6 other areas showing unusual readings that might be worth investigating. Jake Morrison was having the time of his life, completely unaware that his presence on Kepler 442 was beginning to reshape the galactic community's understanding of what humans were capable of. Behind him, in faculty meetings across the station, professors and administrators were trying to figure out how to handle a student who had apparently mastered their curricula before arriving and was now solving problems they hadn't even known existed. The Morrison effect was spreading, and the galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can encounter isn't a monster or a weapon or a natural disaster. Sometimes it's an Australian with time on his hands and a complete inability to recognize the word impossible. 3 weeks after Jake Morrison's arrival on Kepler 442, the station's main computer experienced what could only be described as an existential crisis. The crisis began when the computer attempted to file its weekly efficiency report and discovered that productivity across 17 different departments had increased by an average of 340% since Jake's arrival. This was statistically impossible according to all known models of institutional change, which suggested that either the computer's sensors were malfunctioning or reality itself was operating under different rules than it had been a month ago. The computer's analysis indicated that the source of this impossibility was a single human who had somehow managed to revolutionize the station's gravitational engineering systems, resulting in a 27% reduction in power consumption and the elimination of 3 major safety hazards, solve 14 separate research problems that had been classified as theoretically intractable, improve the efficiency of the hydroponics bay to the point where it was now producing enough food to supply 2 stations, accidentally discover a new form of mathematics, while helping with a quantum mechanics assignment establish what appeared to be a thriving diplomatic relationship with the station's most antisocial alien species through the medium of what he called friendly competition, create a series of improvised engineering solutions that violated several known laws of physics, but worked anyway. The computer spent several processing cycles attempting to reconcile this data with its understanding of reality before finally categorizing the entire situation under anomalous events requiring administrative review. Dr. Zeroff received the computer's report at the same time he received an emergency communication from the Galactic Educational Consortium, 3 formal complaints from species representatives who claimed their students were being corrupted by human methodologies, and a request from the station's engineering department to make Jake Morrison a permanent member of their staff. Computer, Dr. Zeroff said wearily, display Mr. Morrison's current location and activities. The holographic display showed Jake in Hydroponics Bay 7, apparently engaged in animated conversation with Dr. Yilf, while surrounded by what appeared to be plants that were growing in configurations that violated basic botanical principles. Computer, are those plants floating? Analysis indicates that the vegetation in Hydroponics Bay 7 has been modified to incorporate anti-gravitational growth patterns. This should not be possible according to known xenobotanical principles. Dr. Zeroff closed his eyes and tried to remember why he had thought accepting a human exchange student was a good idea. How has Mr. Morrison modified the plants to incorporate anti-gravitational growth patterns? Unknown. Mr. Morrison submitted a research proposal titled Practical Applications of Three-Dimensional Agricultural Matrices in Variable Gravity Environments, which was approved by the Automated Research Review System. The proposal appeared to be a standard botanical study. And now he has plants that float? Technically, the plants are not floating. They appear to have developed root systems that can manipulate localized gravitational fields to support growth in 3 dimensions simultaneously. This is, according to all known science, impossible. Dr. Zeroff made a note to have a serious conversation with whoever had programmed the Automated Research Review System. Has anyone else attempted to replicate Mr. Morrison's results? Negative. Other researchers have expressed reluctance to attempt replication due to what they describe as the Morrison effect, the tendency for human-designed experiments to work perfectly despite violating known scientific principles. The Morrison effect had become the subject of intense debate throughout the galactic academic community. Some researchers argued that humans possessed an intuitive understanding of universal principles that other species had to learn through careful study. Others suggested that Jake Morrison specifically was some sort of probability manipulating anomaly who made impossible things happen through sheer force of personality. A small, but growing faction had begun to theorize that perhaps the problem wasn't with Jake's methods, but with the rest of the galaxy's understanding of what was actually possible. This theory was gaining support as more and more of Jake's impossible solutions proved not only to work, but to work better than anything anyone else had tried. Meanwhile, In Hydroponics Base 7, Jake was having a delightful conversation with Dr. Yilf about the practical applications of three-dimensional farming. See, the problem with traditional agriculture, Jake explained as he adjusted what appeared to be a tomato plant that was growing in a perfect sphere around a small gravitational field generator, is that you're only using 2 dimensions. But if you can get your plants to grow in 3-dimensional matrices, you can increase your yield per cubic meter by about 800%. Dr. Yilf, whose species have been practicing agriculture for 10,000 years, watched in fascination as Jake demonstrated techniques that should have taken decades to develop. The gravitational field manipulation, Dr. Yilf said slowly. How did you learn to integrate it with biological systems? Jake shrugged. Trial and error mostly. Plus, my gran always said that plants are smarter than people give them credit for. You just have to give them the right environment and they'll figure out the rest. Your grandmother practiced gravitational agriculture? Well, not gravitational specifically, Jake admitted, but she had some interesting ideas about maximizing growing space. Used to grow potatoes in vertical towers and tomatoes in spiral patterns. Same basic principle, just with more gravity involved. Dr. Yilf made note to research Earth's agricultural practices more thoroughly. Based on Jake's descriptions, humans had apparently developed farming techniques that were far more sophisticated than their official technological assessment suggested. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Yilf said carefully, would you be interested in presenting your agricultural innovations to the Galactic Agricultural Consortium? Jake looked thoughtful. That sounds interesting, though I should probably mention that some of these techniques are still experimental. The floating tomatoes are stable, but I'm still working out the bugs in the 3-dimensional wheat matrix. Dr. Yilf glanced at what Jake casually referred to as bugs, a wheat plant that was growing in a complex geometric pattern that resembled a mathematical equation more than a traditional crop. According to the monitoring equipment, it was producing grain at nearly 10 times the rate of conventional wheat, while simultaneously purifying the surrounding air and generating small amounts of electrical energy. Perhaps, Dr. Yilf suggested, we could start with the more conventional innovations. Jake's afternoon was interrupted by an urgent communication from Chief Engineer Vorthicay, who had discovered another gravitational anomaly that required immediate attention. This time, the problem was in the station's main power core, where something was causing the fusion reactors to operate at efficiencies that exceeded theoretical maximums. Jake arrived at the power core to find Vorthicay and his team staring at readings that suggested their fusion reactors were somehow producing more energy than they were consuming. That's not supposed to happen, Jake said, studying the display with interest. You can't get more energy out than you put in. Basic conservation of energy. Precisely, Vorthicay agreed. Yet our reactors have been operating at 127% efficiency for the past week. The energy output exceeds input by factors that should be impossible. Jake examined the reactor configuration more closely, paying particular attention to the magnetic containment fields that kept the fusion plasma stable. After a few minutes, he began to grin. "Oh, that's clever," he said admiringly. "You're not actually violating conservation of energy. You're just tapping into zero-point fluctuations in the quantum vacuum." Vorthicay's compound eyes widened. That is theoretically impossible. Zero-point energy extraction requires technology that exceeds our current capabilities by several centuries. Not really, Jake said. You're already doing it, you just don't realize it. See, when you modulate your magnetic containment fields at specific frequencies, you create resonance patterns in the local quantum vacuum. The extra energy isn't coming from nowhere, it's being extracted from quantum fluctuations. For the next hour, Jake explained how the station's fusion reactors had accidentally been modified into zero-point energy extractors through what appeared to be a combination of lucky coincidences and the peculiar way Jake had helped optimize their gravitational systems. The gravitational field modifications you made last week, Jake explained, changed the local space-time curvature just enough to allow the magnetic fields to interact with quantum vacuum fluctuations. It's actually pretty elegant. You're using gravity to amplify quantum mechanical effects. Vorth AK realized that Jake had just casually explained how to build technology that would revolutionize galactic civilization. More disturbing, he had apparently done it by accident, while helping with what he considered a routine engineering problem. Mr. Morrison, Vorthake said carefully, this discovery, it could change everything. Zero-point energy extraction would solve the galaxy's power problems permanently. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Yeah, it's pretty neat, though you want to be careful about scaling it up too quickly. Back home, Dave's cousin warned us about the potential side effects of large-scale quantum vacuum manipulation. Side effects? Well, if you extract too much energy too quickly, you can destabilize local space-time. Dave's mate Steve found that out the hard way when he tried to power Sydney using a quantum vacuum extractor, created a temporal anomaly that lasted 3 days, and turned all the clocks in the city backward. Vorth AK made a note to research human power generation techniques. Based on Jake's casual description, Earth was apparently conducting large-scale experiments with technology that the galactic community considered purely theoretical. As word of the zero-point energy discovery spread through the station's research community, Jake found himself at the center of what could only be described as a scientific revolution. Researchers from dozens of different fields were requesting consultations, convinced that human methodologies might hold the key to solving problems that had stymied galactic science for centuries. The revolution reached its peak when Jake was invited to address the station's weekly academic symposium, a formal gathering of faculty and graduate students from across the galaxy. Jake had never given a formal academic presentation before, but he approached it with the same casual confidence he brought to everything else. His presentation was titled Practical Problem Solving, an Earth-based approach to universal challenges. Right, Jake said, looking out an audience that included some of the galaxy's most distinguished scientists and scholars. I suppose you're all wondering how a blow from Australia ended up solving problems that you've been working on for years. The audience, which had been expecting a traditional academic presentation full of careful theoretical framework and rigorous mathematical proof, was not prepared for Jake's approach. The thing you have to understand about Earth, Jake continued, is that it's what you might politely call a challenging environment. We've got weather that can kill you, animals that want to eat you, plants that are toxic, and geological activity that can rearrange entire continents without warning. So we've had to get creative about problem solving. Jake proceeded to explain the fundamental principles of what he called Australian engineering, an approach to problem solving that emphasized practical solutions over theoretical perfection, creative adaptation over rigid methodology, and the assumption that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing even if you didn't fully understand how it worked. See, the difference between human engineering and galactic standard engineering, Jake explained, is that you folks tend to work out all the theory first and then build things. We tend to build things first and work out the theory later. Both approaches work, but ours is faster. A silicoid physicist raised a crystalline hand. But how do you ensure safety without proper theoretical framework? Jake grinned. Well, that's where the she'll be right mate principle comes in. Basically, you assume everything will probably work out fine, and if it doesn't, you deal with it when it happens. Plus, you always have someone standing by with a fire extinguisher. The audience sat in stunned silence as Jake described engineering approaches that sounded simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. He talked about building bridges without knowing if they would hold, conducting experiments without knowing what the results might be, and solving problems through what he cheerfully described as educated guesswork and stubborn determination. The zero-point energy thing, Jake said, that's a perfect example. You folks have been trying to work out the theoretical framework for zero-point extraction for centuries. But you were so focused on the theory that you missed the practical application that was right in front of you. Sometimes you just have to try stuff and see what happens. Dr. Quell Thor, whose species prided itself on mathematical precision, raised a tentative question. Mr. Morrison, this approach, it seems to assume that trial and error can substitute for rigorous analysis. Not substitute, Jake corrected. Complement. See, The thing about trial and error is that it teaches you things that theory can't. When Dave's cousin was working out the mathematics for temporal loop prevention, she spent months on theoretical models that didn't work. But when Dave accidentally created a temporal loop in his shed, she learned more about practical temporal mechanics in one afternoon than she had in years of theoretical study. Jake spent the next hour describing case studies in practical problem solving that sounded more like adventure stories than academic research. There was the time his uncle had solved a complex fluid dynamics problem by watching how beer flowed out of a punctured can. The incident where his sister had developed a new approach to crystallography by studying how salt formed on the edges of rock pools. The famous Sydney Harbor Bridge project, where engineers had learned more about structural dynamics by dealing with real-world challenges than they ever could have learned from theoretical models. The point is, Jake concluded, sometimes the best way to understand how the universe works is to poke it with a stick and see what happens. Just make sure you're ready to duck if it pokes back. The symposium ended with the longest standing ovation in the event's 300-year history, followed by a queue of faculty members and researchers requesting personal consultations with Jake to discuss problems in their respective fields. Over the following days, Jake found himself inadvertently leading what historians would later call the Great Academic Revolution of 2026. Students began adopting Australian methodologies in their research projects. Faculty members started incorporating trial and error approaches into their experimental designs, and the entire station's approach to problem-solving began to shift toward what Jake had described as practical solutions over theoretical perfection. The revolution wasn't without its problems. Several experiments had to be shut down after students took the poke-it-with-a-stick approach too literally. The station's insurance premiums increased dramatically, and Dr. Zeroff found himself dealing with formal complaints from 3 separate species representatives who claimed that human methodologies were corrupting traditional academic values. But the results were undeniable. Research productivity increased across all departments. Problems that had been considered unsolvable for decades were suddenly being resolved by undergraduate students. And the station's reputation as a center of learning and innovation reached new heights as word of the Morrison effect spread throughout the galactic academic community. Jake himself remained blissfully unaware of the revolution he had started, focusing instead on his coursework and the increasingly interesting projects he kept discovering around every corner. He had completed his original exchange program requirements in the first week and was now working on what he cheerfully described as advanced independent study, a collection of experiments and investigations that would probably have horrified his professors if they had known what he was actually doing. His latest project involved something he called practical applications of multidimensional physics, which appeared to involve building a device that could manipulate spatial dimensions in ways that shouldn't have been possible according to known science. It's not that complicated, Jake explained to Dr. Zixth, who had become something of a reluctant mentor despite his better judgment. You just need to understand that space and time aren't actually separate things. They're different aspects of the same fundamental structure. Once you figure that out, manipulating spatial dimensions is just a matter of finding the right frequency resonances. Dr. Zixth watched as Jake made adjustments to what appeared to be a collection of gravitational field generators connected by crystalline matrix that hummed with energy patterns that defied analysis. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Zixth said carefully, "What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" Jake looked up from his work with a grin that had become familiar to faculty members across the station. "Well, I was thinking about the storage problems you mentioned in the equipment bay, and I figured if we could create a small pocket of expanded space, we could fit a lot more stuff in the same area." "You are attempting to create an expanded spatial dimension." "Just a little one," Jake said reassuringly. "Maybe 10 or 12 times the normal volume. Nothing too ambitious." Dr. Zixth realized that Jake Morrison's definition of not too ambitious was significantly different from the galactic standard. Creating even a small expanded spatial dimension would be the kind of breakthrough that earned entire research teams galactic recognition and changed the course of scientific history. Jake, meanwhile, was treating it like a weekend hobby project. As Jake's final week on Kepler 442 approached, the station's faculty began to realize that they were facing a problem they had never anticipated. How do you handle the departure of a student who has accidentally revolutionized your entire educational institution? Jake had transformed not just the station's approach to research and education, but the way an entire community of beings thought about problem-solving, scientific methodology, and the relationship between theory and practical application. He had solved problems that had been considered impossible, improved systems that were already considered optimal, and done it all with the casual confidence of someone who genuinely didn't understand why everyone else found these things so difficult. The Morrison effect had become more than just an academic phenomenon. It had become a new way of approaching the universe itself. On his last day, Jake was presented with honors from 17 different departments, 3 research awards that had never been given to an undergraduate student, and a formal invitation to return as a visiting professor whenever he wanted. "Thanks," Jake said, genuinely touched by the recognition. "It's been brilliant. Really learn a lot." Dr. Zaroff, who had aged several years during Jake's stay, managed a smile. "Mr. Morrison, I think it's safe to say that we learned more from you than you learned from us." Jake shrugged modestly. "Nah, you folks taught me heaps. Back home, we don't have access to half the equipment you've got here. Plus, it's been great to see how other species approach problems. Give you perspective, you know." As Jake's transport prepared for departure, carrying him back to Earth with a data storage unit full of research notes that would probably revolutionize human science for the next century, the beings he left behind began the process of figuring out how to maintain the momentum he had created. The Morrison protocols became standard operating procedure throughout the galactic educational system. The Australian method was incorporated into engineering curricula across dozens of worlds. And somewhere in the administrative files of the Galactic Educational Consortium, a note was made to prioritize exchange applications from Earth, particularly from a continent called Australia. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the most important discoveries come not from careful planning and rigorous methodology, but from the simple willingness to try something new and see what happens. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that willingness comes in the form of a cheerful human who grins at danger, laughs at impossibility, and approaches the universe with the unshakable confidence that everything will probably work out fine. Jake Morrison returned to Earth as he had left it, as an exchange student who had learned a lot and had some interesting stories to tell. He had no idea that he had become a legend, sparked a revolution, or changed the way an entire galaxy thought about the relationship between humans and the universe around them. But then, again, that was probably for the best. If Jake had known what he'd accomplished, he might have started taking himself seriously. And that would have been a real tragedy.